So, here's something kind of strange. Back in David's time, there was a famine that lasted 3 years, year after year. No rain, no crops, nothing. And when David finally asks God what's going on, the answer points all the way back to something King Saul did decades earlier. Wait, what? A consequence showing up years later? That raises a bigger question. Can a nation feel the weight of something long after it happens? Let's unpack that. Alright, so let's slow this down and really walk through what's happening here. Because at first glance, it's kind of confusing. You've got this moment in 2 Samuel 21. Right, David is king. And not just newly king, he's been on the throne for a long time. We're talking nearly 30 years into his reign. Things should be stable. The kingdom is established. Leadership is in place, but something is off. There's a famine. Not just a bad season, no. This goes on for 3 years, year after year. Crops aren't growing. The ground isn't producing. Livestock is dying. It's like everything that should be working just isn't. And you can almost picture it. Right. That slow realization. Year 1. Maybe people think, okay, it's just a rough year. Weather's unpredictable. These things happen. But then year 2 rolls around. And it's the same story. Still no rain. Still no harvest. Now people are starting to worry. And by the time year 3 hits, it's no longer just a natural problem. It feels like something deeper is going on. And that's when David does something important. He doesn't just keep trying to fix things on the surface. He doesn't just adjust strategy or blame the environment. He actually stops and goes to God and asks, essentially, what is happening here? And honestly, that's a moment worth paying attention to. Because when things don't make sense, that instinct to pause and ask instead of just react, that's significant. So David inquires of the Lord, and then the answer comes, and it's not what you'd expect. God says, the reason for this famine, the reason you've had 3 consecutive years of suffering, it's because of Saul and his bloody house, because he killed the Gibeonites. Now, just sit with that for a second. Saul, David's predecessor Saul, has been dead for years. In fact, we're talking decades. And yet somehow, what Saul did back then, is affecting the nation now. That's the part that makes you pause, because David wasn't even the one who did it. The people living through the famine weren't the ones who committed the act, and yet the consequence is showing up in their time. So naturally, the next question is, who were the Gibeonites? And what exactly did Saul do to understand that? You have to go all the way back to Joshua chapter 9. This is earlier in Israel's history, when they're just entering the land of Canaan. They've already had some major victories, Jericho. AI and word is spreading fast. The surrounding nations are watching what's happening, and they're realizing something. Israel isn't just another group passing through. There's something different about them. They're winning battles they shouldn't be winning. And the reason is simple, they have God with them. Now, most of the surrounding nations respond the same way. They panic. They try to form alliances. They prepare for war. They're basically thinking, we've got to stop Israel before they take everything. But the Gibeonites, they take a different approach. Instead of trying to fight Israel, they decide to outsmart them. And honestly, it's kind of a bold move. They come up with this plan to trick Israel into making a peace treaty with them. But here's the catch. They know Israel isn't supposed to make treaties with the nations nearby. So they can't just walk up and say, hey, we're your neighbors. Let's be allies. No. They've got to make it look like they're from far away. So they stage the whole thing. They put on worn out clothes, sandals that look like they've been through a long journey. They bring old cracked wineskins, dry moldy bread like it's been sitting around forever. Everything about their appearance is designed to tell a story. We've traveled a long, long way to get here. And when they finally approach Israel, that's exactly what they say. They claim they've come from a distant land because they've heard about Israel's God. They talk about how powerful he is, how great his name is, and they ask to make a covenant, a peace agreement. And on the surface, it sounds convincing. I mean, think about it. Their story matches their appearance. Their supplies look old. Their clothes look worn. It all lines up. But here's the key moment. The leaders of Israel look at all this evidence and they make a decision. But they never ask God. That's the turning point. Because instead of pausing and inquiring like David would later do, they rely on what they see, what feels right, what seems logical in the moment. And they say yes. They make the covenant. They agree to let the Gibeonites live among them, to protect them. And once that agreement is made, it's binding. It doesn't matter how it was formed. It doesn't matter that it was based on deception. In their understanding, a covenant, especially one made before God, is serious. It's not something you just break when it becomes inconvenient. Now, here's where things take a turn. A few days later, Israel finds out the truth. The Gibeonites didn't come from a faraway land. They were right there, neighbors, close by the whole time. So now Israel realizes, wait, we've been tricked. And you can imagine the frustration, the anger, the sense of we shouldn't have agreed to this. But here's the thing, they don't attack the Gibeonites. Why? Because of the covenant. Even though it was made under false pretenses, they honor it. They keep their word. Instead of destroying the Gibeonites, they assign them a role. The Gibeonites become servants' woodcutters, water carriers for the community. It's not a position of power, but it allows them to live. So for years, that arrangement stands. The Gibeonites are there, living under Israel's protection because of a promise that was made. Now fast forward, Saul becomes king, and somewhere along the way, Saul looks at this situation and he decides he doesn't like it. Maybe he sees the Gibeonites as outsiders who don't belong. Maybe he thinks the original agreement shouldn't have been made. Maybe he just wants to assert control. Whatever the reason, Saul chooses to act, and he doesn't just challenge the agreement, he breaks it violently. He goes after the Gibeonites and begins killing them. Not just a small incident, this is described as bloodshed, a serious violation of what had been promised. And remember, this isn't just about politics or leadership decisions. This is about a covenant, a word that had been given. So when Saul does this, he's not just attacking a group of people, he's breaking something sacred. Now here's what's interesting. At the time Saul does this, there's no immediate response from God, no instant judgment, no sudden consequence. Life goes on, and eventually Saul dies. David becomes king. Years pass, and it almost seems like that moment, the killing of the Gibeonites, just fades into history. But it doesn't. Because when David asks God about the famine, God reaches back, not to something recent, but to that event. He says, this famine, it's because of Saul, because of his bloody house, because he killed the Gibeonites. In other words, what was done back then still matters now. And that's the setup. You've got a famine in David's time, a question that leads to an answer. And that answer connects the present to something that happened years earlier, something tied to a broken promise and innocent blood. And once you see that connection, you start to realize this isn't just about a random crisis. There's a deeper story behind it. So once you see that whole picture, the famine, the delayed response, the connection back to innocent blood, it kind of reframes everything. It's not just a random crisis anymore. It's not just bad luck or a rough season. There's a cause behind it, even if it took years to show up. And that's exactly where the speaker shifts the focus. He takes that pattern from the story, how God responded to the shedding of innocent blood, and he brings it into the present. Not gently, either. He draws a pretty direct line and basically asks, if that's how God responded, then what do you think it looks like now? Now, he's not talking about a literal famine in the same way. He's not saying crops are failing everywhere or that there's no food on the shelves. Instead, he describes something deeper, a different kind of famine, more like a moral or even spiritual famine. And here's the thing, he argues that you can actually see the signs of it. You don't have to guess. You don't have to overanalyze. Just look around. He starts with what he sees as social disorder. You know those moments where things feel out of control, where basic order seems to be slipping. He points to things like smash and grab incidents, rising lawlessness, situations where people are just kind of doing whatever they want without much consequence. And it's not just one isolated event here or there. It's the frequency, the pattern, the feeling that something that used to be stable isn't as stable anymore. Then he moves into political unrest. And honestly, this one hits pretty close to home for a lot of people. There's this constant tension, left versus right, group versus group. Conversations that used to be manageable now turn into arguments almost instantly. It feels like the temperature is always high. There's less agreement, less trust, and more division. Like the system itself is under strain. And then there's racial tension. He points out how discussions around race have become more intense, more charged. Not just conversations, but confrontations. People talking past each other instead of to each other. And instead of healing old wounds, it often feels like those wounds are being reopened or even deepened. There's this sense that the conversation isn't bringing unity, it's creating more separation. And then he touches on something that kind of sits underneath all of it, cultural confusion. This idea that what used to feel clear doesn't feel clear anymore. Standards shifting. Definitions changing. People unsure of what's right, what's wrong, what's acceptable. And depending on where you look, you'll get completely different answers. It creates this environment where everything feels unsettled, like there's no shared foundation anymore. And when you step back and look at all of that together, social disorder, political unrest, racial tension, cultural confusion, he's not treating them as separate issues. He's saying they're connected, they're symptoms, signs that something deeper is going on beneath the surface. Almost like the land is experiencing a kind of famine, but not in crops, in something else. Something harder to measure, but easier to feel. And this is where he brings the comparison full circle. In the Gibeonite story, innocent blood was shed. And even though nothing happened right away, eventually there was a response, a consequence that affected the entire nation. So his question is, what happens when something similar takes place in a modern context? He points to what he believes is the shedding of innocent life today, and he connects it back to that same principle that actions, especially serious ones, don't just disappear without consequence. Now, whether someone agrees with that connection or not, that's the framework he's using. That what we're seeing around us isn't random, it's tied to something deeper, something that's been building over time. And just like in David's day, the people experiencing the famine weren't necessarily the ones who caused the original issue, but they were still living in the result of it, and that's the part that kind of sticks with you. The idea that consequences don't always show up immediately. Sometimes they take years. Sometimes they show up in ways you don't expect. But then, right when it feels like the message is only critical, he shifts again. Because he doesn't just paint the country in a negative light. He shares something personal. He talks about traveling to Africa, the motherland, and actually seeing it for himself, experiencing the culture, the environment, the reality of life there. And when he came back to the United States, his perspective changed. He says he came back grateful, not because everything in America is perfect, not because there aren't problems, but because, in his view, there are freedoms here that are easy to overlook until you've seen life somewhere else. Opportunities, stability, things that people might take for granted if they've never left. And that moment matters because it shows that his argument isn't just about tearing things down. It's more nuanced than that. He's able to say, yes, there are serious issues. Yes, there are signs of something being off, but also there are things worth appreciating. And then he makes what might be the most important distinction of this whole section. He says the nation isn't perfect, but he also says it's not defined by just one issue, like racism. Instead, he calls it something broader. He calls it a sinful nation. And that's a big shift, because now the conversation isn't about one group versus another, or one problem versus another. It's about something that applies to everyone, a shared condition, something that, in his view, sits at the root of everything else. So when he talks about famine, he's not just talking about what's happening on the surface: crime, politics, culture. He's talking about something underneath all of that. Something that affects how people think, how they act, how they treat each other. And the connection he's making is this: if certain actions go on long enough, If certain things are ignored long enough, eventually something shows up. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in the way people expect, but in ways that are hard to ignore once you start paying attention. And that's where he leaves it for a moment, with this idea hanging there that what looks like chaos on the surface might actually be pointing to something much deeper underneath. Alright, so this is where things start to get a little more direct, because after laying all that groundwork, the famine, the pattern, the signs, he shifts into something very specific. He says there are certain things that a lot of pastors today just don't want to say anymore, and you can feel the tone change here. It's not as much storytelling now, it's more like, okay, let's just say it plainly. So he starts with this first idea, that when everything is said and done, when a person stands before God, there are only two destinations: heaven or hell. And he points out that this isn't something you hear talked about very often anymore. It's almost like the idea of hell has faded out of the conversation. Like it's uncomfortable, so people just avoid it, or soften it, or act like, well, everyone kind of ends up in the same place anyway. But he pushes back on that. He says, no, if you take the message seriously, then you have to acknowledge that there are two outcomes. And here's the way he frames it. It's not just about information, it's about direction. Because if a group of people loses sight of where they're going, then what are they even aiming for? If there's no clear destination, then there's no urgency, no clarity, no real sense of purpose. So in his view, avoiding that conversation doesn't make things easier, it actually creates more confusion. And he kind of lets that sit for a moment before moving on. Then he shifts into something that's been a major topic in recent years: critical race theory. And he doesn't hedge on this at all. He says, as far as he's concerned, critical race theory has no place in the church. None. Now, he knows that's a strong statement, so he explains why. He starts by redefining the core issue. Instead of treating racism as something tied to skin color, something inherent, something you're born with, he reframes it as sin, a choice, something that comes from the heart, not the skin. And that's important to him because it shifts the entire conversation. He writes, if racism is sin, then it's something anyone can commit. It's not locked into one group or another. It's not predetermined. It's something you choose when you look at someone through a lens of prejudice, when you judge based on bias, when you treat someone differently because of how they look. That's the issue, in his view. So when he hears frameworks that say certain groups are inherently one thing or another, he rejects that completely. Because in his understanding, once a person is changed, once they're transformed, that label doesn't stick. And he pushes the point a little further. He says, you don't need outside systems or theories to deal with something the Bible already addresses. The instruction, as he sees it, is simple: love your neighbor as yourself. Not based on race, not based on background. Just love your neighbor. And from his perspective, bringing in other frameworks complicates something that was already made clear. Then he takes it a step further and addresses a specific claim he's heard, that the way to deal with past racism is to apply some form of present racism. And his response to that is pretty straightforward, as he says, you won't find that approach anywhere in Scripture. Instead, the message he points to is the opposite, that you overcome evil with good. Not by returning harm for harm or accusation for accusation, but by responding in a way that breaks that cycle. So for him, this isn't just a disagreement, it's a fundamental difference in how you approach the issue entirely. And then, without really pausing too long, he moves into the next claim. And this one is another that's been widely debated. He says there are only two genders, that's it. Now, he acknowledges that if you go online or scroll through social media, you'll see all kinds of different labels, different categories, different definitions, dozens of them. But he rejects that idea. He keeps it very simple. He says, from his perspective, gender isn't something assigned by people. It's something determined by God. And he frames it in a very straightforward way. You can recognize it, you can see it. It's not something that needs to be redefined. Then he goes into something that, for him, is tied closely to that point. He talks about the claim that men can bear children, and he challenges that directly. Not just as a biological issue, but as something he sees as dismissive toward women. He brings it into a personal space. He talks about watching his own wife go through childbirth multiple times, the pain, the effort, the reality of that experience, and from his perspective, to then say that a man can do the same thing. He sees that as an insult to what women actually go through. So for him, this isn't just about definitions, it's about recognizing something real. Something he's witnessed firsthand. And he argues that there needs to be clarity here, that confusion in this area leads to broader confusion in society. Then he shifts again, and this one lands a little differently because now he's talking directly to leaders, to pastors. He says cowardice is not a fruit of the Spirit, and he emphasizes that it looks especially out of place in someone who's supposed to lead, because in his view, what's happening right now is that a lot of leaders are backing away from difficult topics, avoiding them, softening them, choosing messages that are easier to hear, more comfortable, more agreeable, and he understands why. Because when you say things that are challenging, people push back. You risk losing support. You risk creating tension. But his argument is that the role of a preacher or any leader in that position isn't to make people feel comfortable all the time. It's to speak truth. Even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. And he frames it like this: the goal isn't just to make people feel good. It's to help people feel what they need to feel based on how they're living. And sometimes that feeling is conviction. And he doesn't present that as a bad thing. He describes it as necessary. Like a signal. Like something that points out where change is needed. But in his view, when messages are watered down, when everything is softened to avoid discomfort, that signal gets weaker. And over time, people lose that sense of direction. So his concern isn't just about what's being said, it's about what's not being said. The conversations that are being avoided, the topics that are being sidestepped. And he sees that as part of the larger problem. Because if the people who are supposed to speak clearly stop speaking clearly, then confusion fills that space. And that confusion, in his view, ties back into everything else he's been describing. The signs of famine, the sense that something deeper is off. So as he moves through these points, you can see the pattern. He's not just listing ideas at random, he's building a case, connecting beliefs, leadership, and cultural direction. And at this point, he's only halfway through what he wants to say. But already, you can tell he's not trying to stay neutral here. He's trying to draw clear lines. And whether someone agrees or disagrees, the intention is obvious. To say the things he believes aren't being said, and to say them without backing off. Alright, so he keeps going. And if the first half felt direct, this next part doesn't really ease up. It just continues in that same tone. So the next thing he brings up is abortion. And again, he doesn't soften the language here. He says calling abortion murder isn't some kind of political talking point or something tied to one group or another. It's, in his view, a biblical stance. He pushes back on the idea that this is just a white evangelical perspective, and instead says, no, this comes from Scripture itself. And the way he explains it is by pointing to the concept of innocent blood. He references passages that talk about how seriously that's taken, that the shedding of innocent blood is something God opposes, something that's listed among things that are hated. So for him, this isn't about race or culture or politics. It's about what he sees as a clear moral line. And that ties back, again, to everything he was saying earlier about the Gibeonites, about how innocent blood was shed, and how that didn't just disappear without consequence. So in his mind, this issue isn't isolated, it fits into that same pattern. Then he shifts into something that might catch people off guard a little bit. He says that accountability doesn't stop at personal actions. He extends it to voting. Now that's an interesting move, because voting is usually treated as something separate, like a civic duty, not necessarily a moral one. But he says, no, it's both. He makes the point that people often pray one way and then vote another, and for him, that's a disconnect. Because if someone truly holds a certain worldview, if they believe certain things are right or wrong, then that should influence the decisions they make, including how they vote. So he frames voting not just as participation in a system, but as something that carries responsibility and something that reflects what you actually believe. And again, whether someone agrees with that or not, that's the way he connects it. He's tying actions, beliefs, and consequences together. Then he moves into another topic that's been widely debated, same-sex marriage. And he approaches it in a very specific way. He acknowledges that it's legal, that in the eyes of the law, it's accepted. But then he draws a distinction. He says legality and morality aren't always the same thing. And from his perspective, even if something is legal, that doesn't automatically make it right. So he says, in God's eyes, it's still not aligned with what he believes is true. And he adds something important here. He talks about how these issues can become personal, how they can show up in families, among friends, in close relationships. And when that happens, there's a natural pressure to adjust your views, to soften your stance, to make it fit the situation. But he argues that truth, as he sees it, doesn't change based on personal circumstances, that it's not something shaped by human experience, but something that shapes human experience. So for him, the challenge is to hold to what he believes is true, even when it's difficult. Then he moves into something that feels more relational. He talks about the role of mothers and fathers, and his point is simple but strong. He says they're not interchangeable, that one cannot fully replace the other. Now, he's careful to acknowledge that there are people doing their best in difficult situations, single parents, for example. And he expresses support for them, recognizing the effort, the sacrifice, but at the same time, he maintains that there's a difference between the roles. That a mother brings something unique, and a father brings something unique. And ideally, both are present, because each contributes something different to a child's development. So again, he's emphasizing distinction not to diminish anyone, but to highlight what he sees as a designed balance. Then he shifts to education, public schools specifically, and this is where his tone becomes more critical. He says very directly that the public school system is hostile to the God of the Bible. Now that's a strong claim, and the reasoning behind it is tied to what he sees as a removal of faith-based foundations. He references how, over time, things like prayer and religious principles have been taken out of the school environment, and in their place, other ideologies have come in. So his concern is this: if the system rejects the foundation he believes is essential, then how can it properly guide or shape the next generation? How can it teach and train children in a way that aligns with what he sees as truth? And he frames children in a very specific way as something precious, something valuable, something that needs to be guided carefully. So for him, this isn't just about curriculum. It's about influence, about what's being poured into young minds. Then he reaches what you could call the final point of this list, and he presents it as one of the most significant. He says you cannot be pro-abortion and at the same time claim to follow Christ. Now, that's a very clear line, no ambiguity there. And it ties directly back to everything he's been building toward. Because if abortion is, in his view, the taking of innocent life, and if that's something Scripture clearly opposes, then supporting it becomes incompatible with identifying with those same teachings. So for him, this isn't a gray area, it's a defining one. And then, after laying all of that out, he shifts one more time. Because he doesn't end on division, he actually moves toward unity, but in a specific way. He acknowledges that there's a lot of pressure in society to divide people, to separate them based on race, to create lines between groups, to push narratives that highlight differences over everything else. And he warns that this is something to be aware of. That as time goes on, especially in moments of tension or major events, those tactics will become more visible, more intentional, more frequent. So his response to that is to bring it back to something simple. He says, at the end of the day, we are one blood. That underneath all the categories, all the labels, all the divisions, there's a shared humanity, a common origin. And for him, that truth is what should guide how people see each other, not through the lens of division, but through the lens of unity. So even though the points he's made are strong, even though they draw clear lines, he closes this section by reminding people of something that connects everyone, that beyond all the arguments, all the disagreements, all the tension, there's still a shared foundation that shouldn't be forgotten. And that's where he leaves it right before moving into the next part of the conversation. Alright, so this is where things shift a bit. Up to this point, it's been more of a structured message, but now it turns into a conversation, real time, back and forth. And honestly, this part feels a little more personal, and because instead of just laying out ideas, he starts telling a story, and he says he was at a barber shop. And yeah, he even jokes about it like, I know what you're thinking, how is a bald guy at a barber shop? But he explains he goes to get his beard lined up, you know, the old school straight razor kind of thing. And while he's there, he meets this man, Mr. Fuller. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Mr. Fuller is 84 years old, born in 1938. So this is someone who has actually lived through some of the most intense periods of racial tension in American history. And he just starts talking, sharing his experiences. He tells a story about 1962. He went to vote. Now think about that moment in time. Jim Crow laws were still very real. The South was tense. Civil rights struggles were unfolding right in front of people. And he describes what he saw. Dogs being turned on people. Fire hoses used against them. Just chaos and fear around something as basic as casting a vote. And when it was his turn, he says something that kind of stands out. He tells the woman working there, I don't want to vote as a Democrat, give me anything else. And she responds, well, you could vote as a Republican. He says, I don't really know much about that. So she gives him another option, independent, and he takes it. And here's the part that stuck with the speaker, Mr. Fuller, at 84 years old, is still a registered independent to this day. And the reason that moment matters to him is because it challenges a narrative. There's this idea that gets repeated a lot, that one political party is tied directly to racism, that history is very clean and one-sided. And what he's saying is, it's not that simple. When you actually talk to people who lived through it, when you hear firsthand accounts, it complicates that story. It doesn't fit neatly into the boxes people try to put it in. So for him, Mr. Fuller becomes an example of why it's important to understand history more deeply, instead of just repeating what you've heard. But he also makes sure to zoom out for a second. Because he says, at the end of the day, no political party is supreme. Not Republicans, not Democrats. God is supreme. And that's where he grounds everything. That ultimately, truth isn't determined by political alignment, it's something higher than that. Now from there, the conversation shifts again. Because now they start breaking down some of these terms that get used a lot. CRT, BLM. Things you hear all the time, but not everyone really understands what they mean. So he starts with critical race theory. And he traces it back to what he calls critical theory, more broadly, something that originated from a group of thinkers in Germany. Now, instead of going super academic with it, he simplifies it. He says, think of critical theory like an umbrella. Under that umbrella, you've got all these different ideas, intersectionality, power structures, different social frameworks. And then under that, you've got critical race theory specifically. And the way he defines it is this: it's a lens, a way of seeing the world, and through that lens, everything is interpreted in terms of power and race. So according to that framework, one group is always the oppressor and another group is always the oppressed. And because of that, racism is assumed to be present in almost every interaction, even if it's not obvious, even if it's not intended. And he gives an example. He says, someone might look at him being on stage and say the only reason he's there is because of tokenism, not because of his ability, not because of his knowledge, but because of his identity. And he rejects that completely, because in his view, that kind of thinking reduces people, it strips away individuality and replaces it with a fixed narrative. And then he says something that really captures his perspective. He says that victimhood is being handed out like a crown, like something people are encouraged to wear. And his response is simple: I'm not a victim. He pushes back on the idea that identity should be built around being oppressed, that instead of empowering people, it can actually limit them, and he connects that back to what he saw in Mr. Fuller. Here's a man who lived through some of the hardest times, and yet, decades later, he's doing well, still active, still moving forward. So for him, that real-life example carries more weight than a theory. Then the conversation shifts to Black Lives Matter, and he makes a distinction right away. He says the phrase itself on the surface, it sounds good. Of course it does. But his concern isn't with the phrase, it's with the organization and the ideas behind it. Like, he mentions how, when you look at the stated goals that were once on their website, there were positions that went beyond just addressing injustice. Specifically, he points to the idea of being against the nuclear family. And that's where he pivots to what he sees as a deeper issue. He says the biggest challenge facing Black communities today isn't white supremacy, it's fatherlessness. That's his argument. He points to the breakdown of the family structure as the root of many problems: poverty, instability, lack of guidance. And instead of focusing on that, he believes attention is being redirected elsewhere. So for him, the concern is that energy is being spent on the wrong solution, that instead of addressing what he sees as the core issue, the conversation is being shaped in a way that keeps people focused on something else. And he ties that back into the larger theme of influence. Who is shaping the narrative? Who benefits from it? What direction is it pushing people in? Because from his perspective, if you can control how people see themselves, if you can define them as victims, you can also influence how they think, how they act, and even how they vote. So again, it all connects. History, identity, systems, personal experience, it's all part of the same conversation. And what makes this section stand out is that it's not just theoretical, it's grounded in real stories. A conversation in a barbershop, an 84-year-old man's memory, and then a broader explanation of ideas that are shaping how people see the world today. And you can tell, even in the way he tells it, this isn't just information for him. It's something he's thought about deeply, something he's experienced, and something he feels strongly about sharing. So the conversation keeps going, and this is where it turns toward a really heavy topic: abortion. And you can feel the shift. It's still conversational, still grounded in real experiences, but there's more weight behind what he's saying. He starts by bringing up history. He mentions Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, and the claim that her original vision included targeting Black communities. And from his perspective, that history matters because it shapes how he sees what's happening today. Then he moves into statistics. He says Black Americans make up a relatively small percentage of the overall population, but when it comes to abortion, the numbers are disproportionately high, and that's the part that stands out to him. He points out that Black women, specifically, represent a much smaller portion of the population, yet account for a significantly larger percentage of abortions nationwide. And for him, that imbalance isn't just a statistic, it's a warning sign. He frames it in strong terms, saying this isn't just a general issue, it's something that's deeply affecting Black communities in particular. He even uses the phrase Black genocide to describe it, emphasizing how serious he believes the impact is. And then he raises a question that, for him, doesn't seem to get enough attention. Why isn't this talked about more? Why aren't major organizations addressing these numbers the same way they address other issues? From his point of view, there's a disconnect there. He argues that instead of protecting Black life, certain narratives are actually encouraging something that reduces it, and then he adds another layer. He talks about how abortion clinics are often located in or near Black communities, suggesting that this placement isn't random, it's intentional. Again, whether someone agrees with that interpretation or not, that's how he presents it. That this is part of a broader strategy, not just isolated decisions. And then the conversation shifts from statistics to a personal story. He talks about being outside an abortion clinic. And this isn't something he says he did once or twice. He mentions that he and his family have spent years showing up at these places, trying to intervene, trying to speak to people, trying to offer another option. So in that moment, he's there doing what he sees as advocacy, trying to save lives. And then a man approaches him. A black man wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt. And the man says something that catches him off guard. He asks, "Why are you out here fighting a white man's issue?" And you can tell that moment stuck with him. Because from his perspective, this isn't a white issue at all. In fact, based on the statistics he just shared, he sees it as something that's deeply affecting black communities. So to hear it framed that way, it doesn't line up with how he understands the situation. He describes the moment as tense, confrontational. The man got close, the tone escalated, but he says he chose to stay calm, to take the higher road. Still, the question lingered. How did that way of thinking take hold? And his answer goes back to what he talked about earlier, critical race theory. He suggests that when people are trained to see everything through a racial lens, even issues like abortion can be framed in ways that, in his view, don't match reality. So instead of seeing it as a life issue, it becomes categorized as something tied to race or politics. And that, to him, is part of the problem. Then he widens the lens again. He talks about what actually happens outside these clinics. He says that many of the people trying to help, trying to talk to women, offer support are coming from different backgrounds. And at the same time, many of the women entering the clinics, based on his experience, are black. So again, he sees a disconnect between perception and reality. And from there, he makes a call to action. He says more people, especially Christians, need to be present in these spaces. He points out that there are hundreds of abortion clinics across the country, but only a small percentage have any kind of Christian presence outside of them. And his argument is simple. If you believe something is wrong, if you believe lives are at stake, then showing up matters. Not just talking about it, but actually being there. He even frames it in a very specific way. He says when you're at one of those clinics, there's an opportunity not just to save a life, but also to reach a person. Because many of the women walking in are in a difficult place, and in that moment, they may be open to hearing something different. But then, right when it could feel like the tone is only heavy or confrontational, he shifts again, and this part is important. He speaks directly to women who have had abortions, and instead of condemnation, he offers something else. He acknowledges that many who have gone through that experience identify as Christian, and he tells them, you don't have to stay stuck in that moment. You don't have to carry that guilt forever. He describes forgiveness in a very visual way, like something that's been taken and removed, not meant to be picked back up again, and he emphasizes restoration, that a person isn't defined by what they've done, but by what they can become. So even though his stance on the issue is firm, the way he closes this part is different. It's not about pushing people away, it's about offering a way forward. And that balance between conviction and compassion is really what defines this entire section. So as the conversation keeps moving, it starts getting really practical. People begin asking, okay, what do you actually do if you're in the middle of this? Especially if you're a teacher or someone working inside a public school system where a lot of these ideas are being pushed. And his answer isn't complicated, but it's not easy either. He basically says, you can't just stay silent. He brings up that idea, that evil prevails when good people do nothing, and applies it directly if you see something that you believe is wrong. At some point, you have to decide whether you're going to speak up, even if there's a cost. And he acknowledges that cost. There's risk. You might get labeled. You might face pushback. You might even put your job in jeopardy. But his encouragement is to stand anyway. Not recklessly, not aggressively, but with conviction. With courage. And as he puts it, with truth spoken in love. And then he starts getting really specific about what that could look like. He says people are often waiting for some big dramatic way to make a difference. But sometimes it's smaller than that. It could be showing up at a school board meeting. It could be gathering a group of people to pray outside a school. It could even be running for a position, actually stepping into the system instead of just reacting to it. Or building alternatives. Starting something new. Creating environments that reflect what you believe instead of just trying to survive in ones that don't. So for him, it's not just about resisting, it's about engaging. Then the conversation shifts again, and this time it's more personal. He talks about something called white guilt, and his response to that is pretty direct. He rejects it. He says if one group is supposed to carry guilt because of their identity, then logically, another group would have to carry shame for theirs, and he doesn't accept that either. For him, identity, race, background, culture isn't something to feel guilty about or ashamed of. It's something to recognize and appreciate. And that's where he draws an important line. He says there's nothing wrong with acknowledging cultural differences. In fact, those differences can be good. The problem starts when those differences turn into superiority or inferiority, when they become tools to judge or divide people. That's when it crosses into something else. So his message there is pretty simple. Appreciate differences, but don't weaponize them. And then he addresses something he sees happening on a larger scale. He talks about individuals who, in his view, benefit from keeping racial tension alive. People who, instead of helping resolve issues, keep stirring them because there's influence, attention, even money tied to that role. He calls them race agitators or race hustlers, and his concern is that as long as people stay divided, it's easier to control the narrative, easier to keep people focused on the past instead of moving forward. So again, his argument circles back to awareness, understanding what's actually happening instead of just reacting to what's being presented. And then toward the end of this section, he starts talking about what he's trying to do personally. He mentions a book, but more than that, he describes it as part of a larger movement, something aimed at pushing back against what he sees as harmful ideas. He talks about expanding the message, getting into schools, media platforms, public spaces, not just to argue, but to offer an alternative perspective. So for him, this isn't just a conversation, it's a strategy, an effort to influence culture in a different direction by showing up, speaking out, and building something that lasts. So yeah, when you step back, this whole conversation really comes down to a few things: what you believe is true, how you stand on it, and what that looks like in a world that's constantly pushing back. It touches everything: faith, family, culture, even how we see each other. And maybe you don't agree with all of it. That's okay. But it's worth thinking about, right? If you found this helpful, stick around, there's more like this coming.